Good evening. Good evening. If I could have your attention, we're going to get the program underway. My name's Dominic Fulder. I'm a board member of the FCCT. Suddenly gone quiet. Just a quick look at things on the horizon. We have a program on the 20th, Thursday, that's tomorrow. Which planet is the per-Thai government on? Mechanisms for protecting women and human rights defenders, press conference, report launch. It's a good question. Next Tuesday, we have co-working at the FCCT. If you're looking for somewhere to be a laptop warrior, then this is the place to come. We've got board games night on the evening of Tuesday. That's the next week. And then tomorrow, watch your mailboxes because we've got the first newsletter going out about our podcasts. It's called Dateline Bangkok. It takes its name from the magazine that runs around the bar. And this is the FCCT finally dipping its toes in podcasts. I think we've done 8 already, and you'll find them very good. There's some very interesting people being interviewed there. And then next month, we have, amongst other things, the 50th anniversary of the fall of Indochina, and we'll be doing programs on the fall of Phnom Penh. We will have pictures in the clubhouse from Roland Neveu, who photographed it, who was there at the time. We will try and bring in other people who were witnesses to history. And later in the month, on the 30th, we'll be showing a film, Dateline Saigon, which, if you could pipe down at the bar, we're trying to get things going. Dateline Saigon, which is a film about the very influential, powerful journalists who covered that story. And we may also have people in the club who will witness again to that. We used to have a lot of them, there are not so many left. And then we'll also be showing at some point in the month a film, an author book discussion about Fulro, which was the Montagnard movement in Cambodia, and a new book on that has been brought out. So there's a lot to look forward to. Next month will be very historic as we weave our way through Songkran and other public holidays. Now, we're going to get to Nirmal's book in about 15 minutes. Before we get there, we have a surprise guest for you who is sitting in a railway station. Please, can we have silence? It's too much to fight you. You're here for the program. So we have Steve Herman in Washington in a railway station who's now going to talk to us. Steve Herman is was the first target. He works for VOA. He was suspended in late February, and he'd been the chief national correspondent since 2022, and he'd been the senior White House correspondent for Voice of America between 2017 and 2021. And during the first Trump administration, he was got at, and there was an investigation into his social media posting, and he was completely exonerated at the time. Amongst his other crimes, he was the Associate Director of Membership of the FCCT here in Bangkok in 2016. He was President of the Tokyo FCC, and he's done other pro bono stints elsewhere. So is Steve ready to talk to us? There he is.
Hello, Dominic.
Steve, how are you doing?
I'm doing okay.
And where are you at the moment? You're in a railway station, correct?
No, I'm across the street from the railway station. I'm in a Holiday Inn. I just finished my breakfast here.
Excellent. How was it?
Oh, this is my regular stop. I highly recommend it. Holiday Inn. It's fine dining.
So, Steve, you're in Washington now because you're going to have a major interview with MSNBC. You've been all over the media lately, so we can't claim it's exclusive to us, but we're very privileged to have you nevertheless. And you've been all over the podcast. I was listening to one today on the way up to town. Why are you such a subject of interest? What is your predicament?
Well, I guess, as you mentioned, I was the first among now many to be suspended, so I'm a bit of a poster child. And the reasons that I was suspended have apparently become somewhat notable because I was targeted by a high-ranking U.S. official in the current government, a special envoy of the president, who referred to one of my social media postings, which was nothing more than a quote from an NGO president reacting to the evisceration of USAID, U.S. Agency for International Development. And to paraphrase, basically said, because I'm employed by the U.S. government as a U.S. government journalist, I should only be parroting the lines of what's coming out of the White House and such. And therefore, what I have been posting is tantamount to treason, which is a very serious charge, as you might imagine if you start to look up the penalties for conviction of treason.
Right, and you were put on leave at the end of February, and
Yes.
it's a very bizarre charge, description of your leave. What is it?
Yes, there was a reference in the letter that was sent to me to a recently signed executive order of the president referring to foreign policy. I think it's called like America's One Foreign Policy Act or something like that. Because technically I'm a Foreign Service officer. I'm not under the State Department, I must emphasize. I'm under the Voice of America, U.S. Agency for Global Media, and Voice of America has this firewall, of course, between US AGM and the rest of the government, so I am supposed to operate independently without any undue influence from anyone above me. But the new executive order of the president says that any foreign service officer can be removed or fired if they are deemed to be insufficiently loyal to the president's foreign policy.
Okay, now you were suspended at that time. VOA itself was taken off the air. The website was not renewed on Saturday. It's dead. So 83 years of dialogue with the world by the Americans has come to a halt, for the time being at least. What is likely to happen next? When will we know whether VOA is coming back or whether it's being canned permanently?
Well, Dominic, if VOA is not dead, it's definitely in a very deep coma. I believe that the damage that has already been done is irreparable. Obviously, once those broadcasts aren't there, once the web page is not updated for days, weeks, or months, you're going to lose your audience. And to build them back is going to be very, very difficult. And as you may know, in some parts of the world, we're the only reliable, authoritative source of information, whether it's about their own plight or what's going on in the United States or the rest of the world. In Southeast Asia, of course, we broadcast in Burmese, in Vietnamese, Lao. We also have a Thai service, of course. And we're probably the only entity that's serving the Rohingya sitting in those refugee camps in Bangladesh. We broadcast into North Korea as well. It's about 50 language services in all. So all that has stopped, and there's been no explanation. I remember being in Bangkok more than once when all of a sudden the programming halted on television and the music came on, and we all knew what that meant. So that's similar to what has happened with the Voice of America. The programming has stopped, the music came on, or there's a loop video on, or there's just static, or the website goes dead. What sort of message does that send from the United States about the United States to our audiences all over the world?
This is the second time that you personally have been targeted. Do you have any recollection of acerbic interactions with President Trump? Was there anything to make you that you walked away from and said maybe that wasn't a good idea?
Yeah, it's a great question, Dominic. I not only interacted hundreds of times as a White House pool reporter in the Oval Office, in the Roosevelt Room, on Air Force One, on airport tarmacs, at the World Economic Forum, you name it. I was one of the dozen or so reporters, videographers, photographers that's in that little White House press pool. So whether President Trump ever really cared much about me or the Voice of America, he knew who I was and who the Voice of America was. And I don't think he treated me any differently at any time than any other reporter. Some days he was sarcastic, said that's the greatest question you've ever asked. Other days he might just blow off the question. We weren't treated any differently. I think the difference was that VOA really did not matter much to him because we were not speaking to a domestic audience. So I interacted with Donald Trump as I did with Joe Biden, dozens, hundreds of times. And there was never any indication that he held any personal animosity towards me or my successor, Patsy Widakuswara, this White House bureau chief, although there was a testy exchange between her and him on her last day in the White House last Wednesday when the Irish Taoiseach was visiting. But of course, in the first Trump administration, he did make public comments saying there were really disgusting things coming out of the Voice of America, and the Voice of America was the voice of the Soviet Union, and the White House was upset with that they believed that VOA was disseminating Chinese propaganda because it aired a AP television video clip out of Wuhan after, during the COVID epidemic and things like that, which we all saw as just sort of an excuse to put pressure on members of on Capitol Hill to confirm Donald Trump's nominee for USAGM head, who was Michael Pack, which if you read my book, Behind the White House Curtain, or you Google all of this, there's a lot of information online about what happened with the Michael Pack administration of USAGM and overseeing VOA.
Right, I've got on hand here Nirmal Ghosh, who was for many years the Straits Times correspondent in Washington, which is why we're here tonight. And we have Keith Richburg of the Washington Post, who's going to interrogate Nirmal vigorously. So we're all looking forward to that. Nirmal, Keith, do you have any questions for Steve?
Hi, Steve. It's Keith Richburg. If I can start, just one question. I've got friends in Washington D.C. who are telling me, who work for VOA, RFA, other sections of the government, who are telling me to please switch to Signal because they're worried their email may be monitored. They're saying, don't put any jokes on WhatsApp as we always used to do. I mean, can you just describe the atmosphere in Washington D.C. right now?
Oh yes, Keith. It's really an atmosphere of sadness, of resignation, and as you allude to, a little bit of paranoia. Yes, I'm among those doing most of my communication with my colleagues and others on Signal. It seems to be the favorite app right now here in Washington. I'm not hiding anything. Anything that I say and do right now is pretty public, so I'm not too worried about my communications being intercepted. And I've known for decades, for example, any sort of international communication over most apps or the telephone can be intercepted, as you well know, by the National Security Agency, and it's all computerized and analyzed by AI. I don't think there's anybody physically tapping in real time, listening to our conversations, but all that data's been recorded. But I also believe we had a major situation here last year where it was revealed that the Chinese had basically been able to intercept all of the texts and phone calls in Washington, D.C. So I think the safe thing is just to assume, all of your communications are being monitored or potentially intercepted.
And just one more question for me, and then Nirmal, you might have one, but I'm just wondering, do you believe the Trump administration wants to abolish Voice of America, or do they want to turn it into the Voice of Trump at some point?
Well, I think the latter may have been the idea a couple of weeks ago. But what it looks like happened over the weekend, as was the game plan at USAID and other federal agencies here, that we were doged, right? They just wiped out everything, shut everything down. That's been the game plan out of the playbook of Doge. And those who perhaps wanted to reform or change or keep the Voice of America in some form were overruled by Doge, the Department of Government Efficiency.
Hi, Steve. Nirmal here. Hi. Just
Hi,
going back to Keith's first question, which was the one actually. Thanks, Keith, for asking that. You know, if you see what's happening at Columbia, what's been going on at Columbia University, for example, is it fair to say that even beyond the media, if you look at academia, and I know, of course, the United States is a huge country, right? Is there a narrowing space now for free speech across the board in the States? Is it fair to say that, given what's going on at universities, is a sort of pall over freedom of speech, freedom of expression? Or is that
There's definitely, a perception of a chilling effect. I am right now, because technically I am still employed. I'm suspended with pay. I am still, as of this day, the chief national correspondent of the Voice of America, but not allowed to do any reporting. But I am refraining from sort of making platitudes about wider societal issues and just focusing on my situation, the situation at VOA, the situation at RFE, RFA, not really going beyond that. When I eventually do leave VOA, then I'll probably be much more happy to be frank and engage in the sort of questions that you're asking.
Right. Jonathan Head wants to ask a question.
We good? Thanks.
You're good.
Steve, can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Hi,
Excellent.
Jonathan.
Good to see you. I can remember yours and my last conversation at the Trump-Kim Jong-un summit in Hanoi over a beer. And I was struck at the time by how incredibly objective you were about Trump then. You know, you were really analyzing him and what he was trying to do, taking him seriously. I didn't ever detect any sort of sense of questioning him. You just getting on with your job. Now, obviously, what's happening now is much more dramatic than what happened in the first Trump term. And I'm speaking to people today, diplomats and journalists, who do not feel they can be objective anymore. They feel that the space is being shut down. That if you're a Canadian diplomat, you feel like your country might be occupied by what you thought was your best friend. I mean, has it changed your view on how you deal with the Trump administration, having these extraordinary moves that we've seen in just the past few weeks? Or can you still remain that objective journalist you were when I spoke to you 6 years ago now?
Jonathan, it's a great question. I would say that in my public comments, I've never really posted any opinion on social media since I got on in 2008, except maybe my distaste for pineapple as a pizza topping. What is evident, I would say, is that if you are being objective right now, as I have been in my reporting and on social media, that the response that you will get from people, including high-ranking government officials, is that you're a traitor. I mean, this word is being bandied about a lot. Elon Musk called Senator Mark Kelly a traitor. The president has referred to a number of news outlets in the United States and the Democratic Party's lawmakers in Congress in toto as traitors. And so, of course, I think with some lawyers and perhaps, I hope not, but perhaps with some judges and journalists, that's sort of being targeted is going to have somewhat of a chilling effect. If the Insurrection Act were to be invoked in the United States, and it just sounds bizarre to even be raising the possibility of this. If we had been having this conversation 6 months ago, people would have said you should have your head examined. But if we do see a suspension of civil liberties in the United States, posse comitatus, where it would be possible for the government to just go around and start jailing people for speaking out, it would be quite dire. And I want to stress, though, that would not be unprecedented. We had situations in World War I under President Wilson. It even happened with President Lincoln. And then going back to the John Adams administration in the United States, so you may have heard reference to the Alien Act the other day. There have been times in American history where journalists and editors were jailed for doing their job. And my greatest fear right now is that there's a possibility we may be returning to that in the near future.
Right, we're going to move on shortly. Just one very final question. Where do you expect to be next month?
I would love to be on vacation in Thailand. But under my suspension, I must be available to report to headquarters within 1 day's notice. So Thailand's a little bit out of reach until I either separate voluntarily or involuntarily from the voice of America. But, Dominic, that is a great question. I am taking things at this point, hour by hour, day by day, because I have no idea what's going to be going on a month from now with the voice of America, with media, with this country. And as Jonathan said, I have really, really stayed out of any sort of political expressions. I consider myself fiercely independent as a voter in this country, nonpartisan, and I'm going to hang on to being an objective journalist no matter what.
Well, the best of luck. We have an AGM at the end of the month, so there's a little seat there that could be loosened up if you're looking for asylum, or you could become a mocktail maestro at the bar, whatever. But anyway, look.
I would love that. Thank you.
Our thoughts are with you. Very best of luck. Thank you for being such a good
Good luck, Steve.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you. Appreciate it.
And so to this evening, slightly delayed, where we're going to take a look at Backlash, Donald Trump and the Remaking of America, which was written by one of our past presidents, Nirmal Ghosh, who's had a 30-year career as a foreign correspondent. He's a former US bureau chief from 2016 to 2023 of the Straits Times, and before that he was Indochina bureau chief here in Bangkok from 2003 to 2016. He's also been a president of the Foreign Correspondents Association of the Philippines, and is today retired from the Straits Times, but carries on as an independent writer and podcaster. He was persuaded to write this book by a gentleman called Tommy Koh, who is the eminent grise of diplomacy in Singapore, an incredibly senior figure, and in fact a very close friend of the former Prime Minister here, Anam Paniyarachun. Tommy Koh writes in his foreword, in 2016, Nirmal accurately predicted that contrary to the polls and the pundits, Trump would defeat Clinton. In 2024, he again accurately predicted a Trump victory over Harris. And he produced this book at the best possible time. So that in itself is a major accomplishment. We have sitting alongside him Keith Richburg, who is a former correspondent, also with a 30-year career at the Washington Post, wasn't it? 40. And today he's retired, quotation marks, in Thailand, but he remains on the editorial board of the Washington Post. So Keith has very kindly agreed to grill Nirmal ruthlessly for about 40 minutes. Gentlemen, the floor's yours.
Great. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dominic.
And Nirmal, back in Bangkok at the FCCT, welcome home.
Thank you. Lovely to be back. Yeah.
Let's jump right in because people are really interested in the book. By the way, I've read it. It's a short book, mercifully. It's a good read. I read it in 1 or 2 days, over a couple days, not straight through. It fits nicely in your backpack. So if you want to buy a copy, there may be some left, right? But can I just start? I mean, I'd love to do this. I'd like to start at the end of the book. You wrote this, basically you ended it with Trump's inauguration, kind of, right? I mean,
Right.
the second Trump inauguration, based on the period of time you covered the Trump administration, et cetera. But in the ending, you conclude that it would be wrong to assume that Trump will not face pushback. And you mentioned, from example, from the Republican Party, from local governments, from the courts, et cetera, et cetera. And then you go on to say that the imminent implosion of the United States may well be exaggerated. It's an era of turbulence which is upon us, in which political and cultural wars will likely become more feral. But you mentioned here that you say built-in checks and balances, freedom and separation of church and state, to name just 3, will be tested. We've now had 3 months of the Trump administration.
Yeah, already sounding detailed.
You've already got, if you had to write that section over again, what would you write?
I think I'd write several paragraphs more. For sure. No, I think that's true, actually. They are being tested, and if you see what the president of the Supreme Court recently, just yesterday, said about, he pushed back against this rhetoric from Trump and from Elon Musk about judges should be impeached if they get in the way of presidential orders and stuff. So he issued a statement pushing back against that. So that is an example of the checks and balances. So they are sort of holding at the moment, but they are under serious strain for sure. And on the separation of church and state, I think that is also something which is in progress. I think this goes back to a lot of what I write about in the book. It goes back to the origins of the U.S. and the perennial tension over religion and morality, which lies at the core of some of the cultural wars of the U.S. And we are seeing basically the rise of white Christian nationalism, or I should even, as someone corrected me the other day, saying straight white Christian nationalism, right? So that is sort of the overtone of what we are seeing right now. Yeah.
It's interesting because you write about this rise of kind of white Christian nationalism, nationalism in general, but you also mentioned that whites are becoming a smaller percentage of the population. Explain that.
By 2045 or so, white people will be just another group in the U.S., no longer a majority, and this is, this is not talked about very openly by Trump and all the rest in this campaign, but the fear mongering about immigrants is part of that. This is a sort of a in a larger context, this sort of date, this sort of watershed in America looms over everything, which is why now you see this fear mongering about immigrants. You hear things like you see Marco Rubio in his opening statement at the Senate confirmation hearing talking about Europe and migrants flooding into Europe and our people coming under threat. So what does that all tell you? The subtext is this looming, and it's a psychological fear. And this is another core tension at the heart of America. It's an immigrant nation, but when you have too many immigrants, what happens then? What does it mean? Identity politics, what does it mean to be American? How do you define being American? And a lot of the Trump base defines being American as basically white and Christian. And conservative at heart, not the wokeism and the LGBTQ rights and all that stuff happening, right? So that is how they are They define being American. So it's identity politics at the core of it. And and this is not new in America, as you, of course, many of you know, when a particular dominant group comes under threat, often it reverts into sort of nativism, right? It retreats to its perceived original cultural identity. So that is what I think we're seeing in the US.
Yeah, it was fascinating to read because as a foreign correspondent, I've been covering other countries, looking at it through the lens of being American, writing about the other. You wrote this as the other being based in the United States, so you're looking at America through the lens of a non-American foreign correspondent. So I thought that's what I found most fascinating about this, right?
Yeah. No, it's very interesting. I actually was asked this. I was talking I gave a talk I think it was in City University in London, just after coming to the States and after Trump won in 2017. And someone asked me, so what expectations do you have? How do you approach America? And to me, as a foreign correspondent, the answer is simple. I approach America like I would approach any country. Like I approach Thailand or Zimbabwe. You're there to learn. You're not there to bring your expectations to the story and to make judgment calls. Yes, you can write, opinions and whatnot and express your personal feelings. But in your reporting and analysis, you're more like a doctor or a forensic scientist, sort of explaining, analyzing what is going on. You're not supposed to bring your projection. You're not supposed to project your expectations onto the country that you're covering. That's basic part of the job.
One of my favorite parts of the book is something, and again, when I'm talking to non-American friends, I often say the same thing, not as eloquently as he wrote it here. You say it's useful to understand America politically and culturally, to see it as many different countries and appreciate the unique antipathy Americans have towards an overbearing government. Talk about the many different countries, because people, and you mentioned here, it's the United States with an S on the end.
Yeah, right. So basically, when I had this conversation with Tommy Coe, when he persuaded me to write the book, he said, people really don't understand America. And we talked about it for a while, and I realized that, foreigners go to America as tourists, okay? Or they have their kids in American universities. So they go to visit their kids in a university town. If they go as tourists, they go and see the Smithsonian in D.C., they go to New York, they go to maybe Yellowstone, that kind of stuff, Grand Canyon and all that. But they don't really go out into small American towns. They don't visit the heartlands of many different states. And 7 years I was there, I only scratched the surface, really, honestly. And you find every state is basically the size of, Maryland is the size of Belgium. Canada.
The fifth. That's our 51st.
I apologize. Got this slip.
Are there any Canadians here?
Yeah,
We're
there you
sorry
go.
about that.
Yeah, and California, Texas and California.
We're coming.
Texas and California by themselves are among the top 10, 12 economies in the world, right? So, and there's an old joke in America that a governor, even a senator, I think, gets up in the morning, looks in the mirror and sees a potential president. So there are governors who run states the size of California and Texas, and they're quite capable of pushing back against the federal system. And this antipathy towards strong federal government is built into the whole American mindset. So I think that is very important for people who don't understand America, who see America as it's very deceptive. You go to the small towns, you get the Walmarts, the McDonald's, the Starbucks. The landmarks are the same. The chain stores, everything is the same. So you get this illusion of homogeneity, right? But it is not so at all. Each state is quite different from the rest, and they have their own sense of statehood and culture, and they have their own politics. So.
No, it's absolutely fascinating. I try to go back every summer. We go to a different state. New Mexico is nothing like, California is nothing like Massachusetts. Let me ask you one thing. I find, I as a correspondent, I was based in New York during 2008, 2009. I covered the 2008 election when Obama was elected. Many of us were writing, perhaps incorrectly, that we had entered a post-racial stage. Explain what happened. How did a country that elected a black man as president twice switch and elect Donald Trump?
Yeah, I think that requires like the entire night's discussion. and another book twice the size of that. But yeah, I mean, I think, Barack Obama was, he himself said it. He said it was a delusion that after he left office, he said it's not a post-racial society at all. It was a complete delusion. And there are various ways of explaining it. Of course, the African-American vote turned out because he was the credible and an amazing orator and a candidate of his time, right? The right person at the right time in history. And of course, he was also very erudite. He talked like a college professor. He was from sort of Ivy League background and all that. And so for the elites, he was also acceptable. He wasn't a rabble-rouser. So there have been a couple of papers written on this. A couple of friends of mine in London, Indrajit Parmar and all, have written that he was kind of acceptable to the majority of Americans because he talks like us. So there was that perception that, he's black, which is nice and all, okay, but you remember, when Barack Obama first came to power, there were people who hated it. There were people who said, we are losing this country. So it wasn't all, roses all the way. And I think I quote from Ta-Nehisi Coates in this, a very pungent quote. He said that one of the main reasons Trump came to power in 2016 was that he was not black, he was a white guy, So this is the title of the book, Backlash, is basically taken from an old quote by Seymour Martin Lipset, writing in the late 60s, which shows you that nothing really changes much. That America whipsaws back and forth in this kind of pattern of backlash, and whiplash, in fact, could be my next book.
I'll tell you a funny but true story. I sent one of my news assistants from New York down to Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania during the 2008 election to interview people. She talked to a union leader who said many of his members were resistant to voting for Obama because he was black. And she said, what do you tell them? She said, well, I tell them he's half black and half white. Just vote for the white half.
Yeah. Very important. Yeah.
Very important.
Yeah.
But it's interesting because you also say here in the book that Trump came along and you say Trump recognized and validated the feelings of millions of forgotten Americans in depressed small towns, worried about job insecurity in a world changing fast around them. How does a billionaire who lived in a tower in Manhattan, who's married to a supermodel wife, speak to forgotten Americans? I don't understand that.
So it's quite interesting. Basically, if you go back and look at the misery that middle America, my old small manufacturing towns were plunged into, it goes back to 1999, November in Seattle, 99. There were tens of thousands of people in the streets protesting against the WTO meeting over there, which had liberal, globalized free trade agenda. And these guys, and they were farmers' unions, labor unions, international and local NGOs, students, everybody was in the streets. They did not want the agenda. It was rammed down their throats. In subsequent 3 decades, they basically lost millions of jobs, thousands of factories closed down, and then came 2008, the recession. Barack Obama, everybody's favorite progressive president, bailed out the big corporates and left, the middle and lower middle class out to dry. They'd been predated on by the lenders, and there was just a build-up of disillusionment. And this disillusionment was not just against the Democrats. It was also, it extended to the entire political sort of moneyed, entitled, dynastic political class in DC, which was beholden to special interests, which was corrupt and so forth, got America embroiled into disastrous overseas wars. Remember, there were millions of people in the street protesting against the Iraq invasion. In Europe, there were millions. In the US, there were millions. They were completely ignored, just like in 99 Seattle. Now, this is another thing, that even a democratically elected government basically ignores its people a lot of the time. So Trump, that is one of the other appeals of Trump, was that Americans by and large have not really been in sync with their foreign policy. If you remember Vietnam, right? They were not really in sync with it. There has not been much, apart from the exception of 2000, in modern history of the 9/11 attacks, there's never been much enthusiasm for regime change and promoting democracy overseas and whatnot in the American public at large. And the appetite after the rally around the flag effect of 9/11, they went into Afghanistan, fine, but then they got bogged down for 20 years. The appetite for getting bogged down overseas in these wars and people coming back in body bags evaporates very quickly when people are getting killed and when the wars become very expensive and there's no light at the end of the tunnel. So Trump, yes, he was a billionaire, but remember, he was from Queens. He was seen as a hustler from Queens. And the Manhattan sort of elites made fun of him regularly. They were always making fun of Trump, right? Everybody has always been dissing Trump. They laughed at him. But if you read Newt Gingrich's book, on which I quote from also there, he makes a couple of interesting observations. He said, you know, Trump lives a life of absolute luxury, right? His gold-plated stuff, his plane and all that. You hang out with him at his golf club buffets and in his plane. You get a team of chefs preparing a massive buffet and whatnot. Trump he bypasses everything. He goes for the cheeseburger and fries. He's that kind of guy. So he was seen as an outsider. And as I said, the disaffection with the political class extended to Republicans as well. So he was able to, and you know, some of the key people behind his campaign, like Steve Bannon and others, recognized that he had the charisma. And the moment was ripe for someone like Trump to come in and grab the imagination of his base. And his base believes that, how to put it? A lot of his base believes that he has been the white Christian nationalist base, ethno-nationalism. They believe that he has been sent by, and I've spoken with Trump supporters at his rallies. I've spent hours and hours with Trump supporters. Many of them just believe he's been sent by God to look after the United States. And they were basically sick of being called, hillbillies and rednecks and dissed by, Hillary Clinton very famously sank her campaign with that deplorable remark, saying all Trump supporters are deplorable. They're all racist and deplorable.
A basket of deplorables.
Yeah, a basket of deplorables. You know, they're racist, and she enumerated it. I mean, that's not the way to win the votes of these people you're calling deplorables, right? Mm-hmm. So that she was just seen as another entitled elitist, elite from the political class in D.C. So they saw Trump as a maverick, as an outsider, and who was not beholden to all these forces which had corrupted the DC political class, and also that Trump did not believe in the sort of doctrines of the DC foreign policy, the blob, the establishment of going into wars overseas and all that. Mm-hmm. And they also wanted a strong leader. There's the allure of a strong man when your economy is not doing that well, when you have problems, when you have these anxieties, someone tells you immigrants are coming to rape your daughters, take your jobs, and someone comes along and says, I'm going to sort it all out for you. Vote for me, I'll throw criminals out, I'll restore the economy, everything's going to be fine, vote for me. It's a very strong appeal. They want Americans like a leader, and Trump showed himself as a leader from the start.
How do you that explains why Trump won in 2016. How do you explain how he won in 2024? Because he cut taxes for the rich. He didn't actually, or correct me if I'm wrong, did he actually do much to help those people?
No, not that much. Wasn't successful, but Keith, I think that one of the points I tried to make is that America has some of the most sophisticated public polling mechanisms in the world, right? Mm-hmm. You can slice and dice public opinion on any issue, suburban, urban, rural, on any issue under the sun. I think that does not adequately capture the idea of emotion. And identity politics is about emotion. It's about human dignity. It's about human identity and dignity. And that is an emotional appeal which he is very good at. Mm. The other factor in the recent election was that Biden was seen as weak. And they messed up by Biden's this dithering over whether Biden should run or shouldn't run. They lost a lot of time. Kamala Harris, I believe briefly, I was kind of swept away. I believe briefly that she might be able to rise to the occasion.
You got the vibe.
I got the vibe. and then very soon I realized it was not going to happen because Gaza was continuing. She could not distance herself. Mm-hmm. She did not have the charisma to bring out the African American vote en masse. She was
no Obama, in other words.
She was no Obama. Neither was she a Michelle Obama. And she was into the abortion issue, which appeals to a very narrow relatively narrow segment at the end of the day. And she could not also, she did come through the primary process. She did not, have that, and it was a problem for her because she couldn't buy the job. I think she got unfairly dissed by the media as vice president, saying she was ineffective and all that. But part of the job of the vice president is you're not supposed to outshine the president. And you cannot outshine, especially a president who's getting old and a little bit past it, like Joe Biden, right? It would have been an even worse disaster. So I think none of the stuff was addressed. There were migrants coming in. Even the New York Times the other day said something like, I think 8 million migrants, mostly illegal, were coming in across the border. So then here's this demagogue who comes and stokes that old fear of migrants and all that, right? And people feel that the economy is not doing well. And you rarely find people praising the government anyway, in any country you go to. They always say there was something to complain about, right? In Biden's time, the economy was doing okay. But then if you didn't feel it was doing well, and you were told repeatedly that it's going to get worse under Biden because the migrants are coming, et cetera, then that I think was the backlash to Biden. That's why Trump won.
If you had to pinpoint one reason why Kamala Harris lost, would you pick inflation? Would you pick transgender? Would you pick immigration, transgender, inflation? Because she was a woman? Because she was a woman of color? Or is it all of those?
I think it's all of those, but I'd say immigration would be near the top of the list because she was made the border czar by Biden, but she didn't do much on that front. She took a lot of criticism, and the migrants kept coming. So I mean, all of those, but that would be at the top of the list.
And one thing, you spend a lot of time in this book. I really highly recommend it. You spend a lot of time talking about globalization. When I look at globalization, the World Trade Organization, et cetera, I see America that became prosperous. We could buy anything we want from around the world a lot cheaper. Cars were cheaper because they were made in Mexico and Canada with parts from China. My iPhone is cheaper. I got a better world in my life because of globalization. But I'm not normal. I'm not you. Is that correct? As an American, I'm not the quintessential American.
Yeah, you're not. I think it's very interesting how one of the takeaways I had from my time in the States, and this is also common in other countries, you live in your bubbles, right? We all live in our bubbles, and sometimes we don't even know we're in a bubble, because our bubble is very seductive. It's very nice to be in our bubble, and you are not living in a small town, in tiny town of like 1,500 people in America where the local coal mine is shut down because of environmental regulations under Barack Obama, or where all the factories shut down because all the jobs went to Indonesia. You're not living there. You live in you're part of what is loosely called the coastal, globalized, liberal elites and so forth. And that's a very seductive bubble, and I think there was a lot of denial on the part of the left in America, on the part of those coastal elites. There was a lot of denial, and they just didn't want to see this other. Even after Trump won the first time around, people were slow to learn the lesson. They still didn't get it. There's just so much denial and so much time. It's easy, for example, to hate, to not like Trump, right? I mean, when you go around the world, people have very strong opinions of Trump, which is another reason why I wrote the book, because if you go to Singapore, people either love Trump or they hate him. They think he's amazing or they think he's an absolute cad, right? So it's easy to spring to these conclusions because people, you get your information through the echo chamber media. You listen to media, you watch media, which reaffirms your own basic biases, right? And you get context-free and ahistoric information. If you listen to American cable TV in the wake of the Hamas attack, you would think that the Middle East problem started with that attack. You just don't get the longer context, right? So if you keep listening to this and our attention spans are getting shorter and shorter, generally we need simple answers to very complex questions. And that is also a reason, I think, which, the mainstream or legacy media, I hate those terms, but, for want of a better term, We are suffering because we know that there are no simple answers to these complex questions. But someone who can come to you and say, hey, this is the answer, black and white. You are going to lose your job. You lost your job because of an immigrant. I'm going to bring that job back. That's the appeal of it.
Talk a little bit more about that, because we're at the Foreign Correspondents Club here, and you were not too nice to the mainstream media in the book. You say here, suspicion and disdain for the media have grown, but you say that they brought this on themselves. Biases and agendas are nakedly apparent. What biases and agendas do you see in the American mainstream media?
Well, I mean, if you, I'll give you a little anecdote. I met the ambassador in the U.S. over in Southeast Asian country just after he had made a trip back to his home country. And I said, this was just 6 months into the Trump administration. And I asked him, I said, so what are people saying back home? What do they think of Trump? And he said, they think he's going to be kicked out of office in 6 months. And I was like, what, really? Why? He said, they only listen to CNN International. That's what they... So if you listen to your own media universe, you will listen to liberal media channels, or on the other side, you will listen to a range of channels, right? Ranging from the ONN, whatever it is, One America Network, Newsmax, more right-wing, and then you come to Fox. You live in that universe. There is no other universe, and you don't want to know about the other universe. The people who want to know about the other universe are vanishingly small now. They're not interested in the other universe at all. I've had Trump supporters ask me, standing in rallies with them, I've had Trump supporters ask me, so you speak to the other side too? And I say, yeah. So what do they say about us? One guy asked me. Do they think we're racist? You know, they ask me questions like that. It's like completely different universes. And the media perpetuates this. In fact, Bannon made a very interesting remark in a PBS Frontline interview, and I think it was in 2019. He said the media created Trump. Trump plays the media like you play a cat with a laser beam. You know, and the media is complicit, by the way, in Elon Musk as well. You know, he's a billionaire, but the media flocks to every word that comes out of his mouth like he's some oracle, right? So the media is very much complicit in all this stuff.
You write in the book, tell the audience about what the advantage you have being a foreign correspondent going to a Trump rally or talking to these folks.
Yeah. Because the first at Trump rallies in particular, the first reaction is hostility when you say you're from the media, because they think everybody is, the media is against them. Because Trump called them, the media in America, the media the enemy of the people and so forth. So when I said, oh no, I had to be upfront and say, I'm a foreign correspondent, and I from a paper in Singapore, and I don't have a dog in the fight. I'm not an American correspondent. And then they were much more, open to talking to me, and they were kind of intrigued. Oh, what's it like in Singapore? That kind of stuff. And they kind of opened up.
Did they know where Singapore was?
Some of them did. Some of them did.
It's when I was reading it, it was really interesting. It was hard to think about that. I'm reading about my own country. When you talk about 40 million people live in poverty, 18.5 million people in extreme poverty, 5.3 million people live in third world conditions. The citizens are shorter and live sicker lives than compared to any other OECD countries. And in 2018, the United States had over 25% of the world's billionaires.
Yeah, the wealth gap has become so enormous. It's basically, and Robert Reich and other people have been talking about it. And Bernie Sanders famously, he bangs on about it. But Bernie, everybody loves Bernie, but he's not, not really electable in the American scheme of things as a president. But the wealth gap has become so obvious. If you just look at the data, there's been in the last 30 to 40 years a massive transfer of wealth from the bottom half to the top, and the 1%. I forget the exact numbers now, but they're easily available if you Google them. The top 1% has more wealth than the entire bottom 50%. That's what the Occupy Wall Street protest was all about. Another protest which brought millions on the streets, they closed down the Brooklyn Bridge. Remember all that? Also ignored, completely ignored. So there were many red flags along the way. Trump was just the agent who poured gasoline on this smoldering discontent, and it just exploded. That's what.
The book is called Backlash, Was that a backlash against Obama as a black president? Was it a backlash against the financial crisis? Was it a backlash against globalization? Or all of the above?
All of the above. I think all of the above. When that also goes back to a quote which I cite from that essay by Seymour Martin Lipset. Back in 1969, I mean, this is none of this is actually very new, right? Like, for example, even Steve was talking about a previous era when, journalists were, jailed and whatnot. So this kind of happened before, and it's always been the case in the U.S., I found. If you read all the old essays by the political analysts, so Lipset said that backlash politics is characteristic of America. And the rise of Trump, this is, of course, now in contemporary times, the rise of Trump was a backlash to everything you mentioned. The damage that not globalization per se, but the damage that globalization wrought on America. It was badly mismanaged. I think Europe managed globalization better. But even now in Europe, we're finding a backlash against immigrants, right? So backlash against globalization, against wokeism, which Barack Obama again famously warned against, too much wokeism. There was all this controversy over same-sex marriage, wedding cakes for same-sex couples, took up a lot of acreage, of news acreage, this was huge in America, the so-called culture wars. It was a backlash against the foreign wars. It was a backlash against religion and morality was a big part of it, I would say. So it's prejudice against immigrants, Barack Obama, a black president, and a sort of black president who was somewhat, like a college professor type, talking down to people. He made nice speeches, but, And then remember, he was criticized for doing the famous apology tour. So, Obama had a lot of criticism. A backlash against the economic deprivation, sort of rage, a backlash against the media collapsing trust in the media, and backlash also against the political class, as I said before, and against democracy. In fact, a large percentage of Americans believe that the democratic system wasn't working for them, because the people they elected became part of the Washington political bubble, and then looked after their own interests and were were being paid by special interests, by big pharma, the whole range of them, right? So there was a collapsing faith in democracy as well, and which is why some polls actually say that a significant percentage of Americans welcome the idea of a strong man, and some even say a military government is not a bad idea.
That's frightening in a way. Please get ready to ask questions, because I've just got one or two more of my own, so please go up to the microphone there. Just one or two more from me. What you just said was very frightening. Do you think American democracy will survive?
I think American democracy will survive, but we're talking about a particular brand of liberal democracy. That may not survive. It will become an illiberal democracy, which is already starting to happen. But democracy as such, it was the democratic system that brought Trump to power the second time around. He was a product of a functioning democracy, and there was a peaceful transition of power, right? So you can't say that democracy is not working. It's working. But what kind of democracy? And I think liberal democracy, that experiment is now in great danger.
And just let me push back a little bit on this question of globalization, because it fascinates me. In my home state of Michigan, for example, which was hard hit economically, on the other hand, Chinese companies came in and bought some depressed factories and revitalized them. In farming communities, farmers are now being able to prosper by selling their farm products to China. Hasn't globalization actually helped some of these depressed communities?
It has in some cases, yes. And in fact, the influx of capital and of talent has helped also in Silicon Valley, right? The startups, the foreign talent coming in, the smart talent, big global markets opening up for agricultural produce. But if you look at the data, starting from the early 90s, late 80s in fact, the steady attrition of the small town manufacturing base, and at the same time the steady rise of migrants of other races, right? And this is, America has had prejudice against migrants for ages. prejudice against Italians, against Irish, against Japanese, against Chinese, against Catholics. It's been going on since the start of the Republic, right? And now a little bit against Indians now, suddenly, you know. So I think that was those trends were too great. And the fact that they thought their values, even a farmer in Iowa or Michigan making money from China, from exporting China to China, that might be fine. But if he thinks his values are under threat, right? His conservative family values are under threat, then it's a different thing altogether. It becomes an emotional thing. Like I said, you know, I think we sometimes get too carried away with data and we discount the role of human emotion, how they feel about, how people feel about religion, identity, morality, stuff like that. You know?
Oh, I see somebody at the mic already. Please, go ahead.
Oh, hello.
Please identify yourself.
Well, my name is Nick Bazzani. I'm not sure if this is on. I'm an interloper from London. You mentioned the checks and balances. And in the first Trump term, the Supreme Court was packed with a right-wing court, 6-3, built in. How likely is it, do you think, this being the ultimate arbiter of all the disputes that they'll take place between Congress and the various arms of government, Department of Justice, let's imagine he gets two of the right-wing, elderly, Clarence Thomas could be one, they decide to quit. Do you think Trump could sufficiently corrupt the system so that he puts in judges that mean much extrajudicial stuff that he's up to now is actually endorsed by the Supreme Court?
It's conceivable. I think it's conceivable.
It is.
I think the social contract aspect of democracy is very strong in the States. There's a sense of great independence. You know, I mean, as we know, the U.S. you know is based on individuals, right? I think the concept of rights is very strong in the States. The checks and balances is very ingrained in the U.S. system. But conventions don't mean anything to Trump. That's the whole point of it. You know, coming in and closing down, you know, entire government departments in 24 hours. Once you have someone who's willing to just forget about convention, then there's no point throwing your hands up and saying, oh my God, what's happening? This is America. How can this happen? You know, but it's happening. Sorry, it's happening. And all you need is someone who is willing to completely disregard all that convention. And you have someone like Trump. But then again, as I said, I mean, checks and balances are very much part of the American system. They're part of the the DNA of the United States. And the fact that Supreme Court Justice pushed back just yesterday on the idea of just impeaching judges who came in the way of presidential orders is a good sign. So you're not going to get us, even if it's back with conservatives, to a greater extent in the near future, you are not going to get a supine Supreme Court. I don't think so. I can't predict anything more than 4 or 5 years. We have to wait till the midterms. I think the one big watershed will be the midterms. One red line, I think, is whether court orders will be obeyed. They're only as good as they are enforced. They're enforced by the U.S. Marshal Service. Who is the commander-in-chief? It's Donald Trump, right? The president. So that's one big red line which we have to watch for. And there's pushback, again, as I mentioned. The other watershed will be the midterms to see what happens if the system, if the Trump administration works within the system, if the system holds and the wheels don't start coming off. I think the midterms will be the big thing.
Next question. Just please identify yourself.
Yes, James Tratier. I'm a former long-time Canadian diplomat in Asia, including in North Korea and South Korea and in Thailand and in the U.S. And before my question, just a comment, I would say that Canadians have rarely been so united, including in World War I and World War II, as they are at this moment. The conservative opposition to the current Liberal government had a 30% lead in January, which has completely evaporated thanks to President Trump's comments in the last 2 months. But my question is on another related subject. Given President Trump's tendency to turn on American friends and allies and cozy up to adversaries, especially strongmen, how worried should South Korea be about being sold out in a grand bargain between Kim Jong-un and Donald Trump? And also, should Taiwan be worried?
Ooh. I think I'd rather hear your thoughts on that question, or Keith's. I don't know, but I sometimes remember what Singapore's former Perm Sec Bilahari Kausikan has said for some years now. He said that eventually South Korea and Japan will go nuclear, and there'll be parity, and then all the American troops can come back, and that's it, and everybody's on their own. So that's one possible scenario.
Taiwan?
Taiwan, I don't see Trump expending American lives defending Taiwan. I don't see his base approving of it at all. No, not gonna happen.
Next question. Please identify yourself.
Hello. Hello, my name is Leighton Tonkin. I don't really have a profession because I'm 16. I'm still a bit young.
And the microphone's a bit short, too.
It is a bit short. Is there any way to... Oh, there we go. Sorry, I didn't realize I could bend it. Yes. So I just have some general questions around, the state of Europe with Russia's aggression into Ukraine and different things. France, I believe, recently announced a desire to extend the nuclear curtain around most of Western Europe. And being so young, I know that whatever crisis ensues, I'm going to have to live through it. What is your opinion upon the possibility of an extension of the nuclear arsenal, and will we start remilitarizing again?
Yeah, I
Good
think
question.
Europe has already started remilitarizing. Absolutely. I mean, look, everybody has realized, a lot of countries, the international community has realized, number one, how dependent they have been on the US, and that they have been too dependent on the US, and they have been free riding to a great extent on the US. And it's not a bad wake-up call to get. And of course, it will have ramifications. What happens when Germany starts arming up? What happens when France? I mean, it'll unleash forces that we could see 10 years down the road, some crazy stuff happening, right? So unfortunately, what you said is true. It's a much more uncertain world, and it's been arming up for quite some time. If you look at the data from Stockholm Peace Research Institute, the military expenditure around the world has been going through the roof, and it's going to go much more through the roof now in Europe, with Europe arming up. Europe has to arm up. They've seen the writing on the wall. Canada as well. I don't know, Keith,
No, I agree. I mean, I was going to ask you the question. Thank you for that question. I was going to ask you the question. I mean, Trump so far has been looking at Europe and Canada. Asia has so far kind of escaped his gaze. I mean, should Europe... I mean, there are U.S. bases in some countries. They have base agreements in others, like Singapore. They do Cobra Gold exercises in Thailand. Should those countries feel like, oh, he doesn't care about us, or he wants us to counter China? Or should they be thinking he's going to abandon us the same way he's abandoning the Europeans? Which way should Asia be thinking?
I think the China factor is in favor, in a way, of the states around, the small and middle powers around China. Now, the Americans have started reinforcing their, putting a material and people into Subic Bay in the Philippines, for example. Mm-hmm. They are bound by treaty to defend the Philippines. So the so-called frontline states, which say against China, China remains the huge psychological boogeyman for the US. It is not just another peer competitor. It is a peer competitor with a different civilization. It's a completely different people, a different civilization. So it represents something very scary for the American, for the American strategic elites, the mind, and the American public at large. You remember the fuss over the Chinese spy balloon, which nobody really knows what it was, but for weeks they were fixated on this balloon. Right? This is how fear of China is amped up in Washington, D.C., right? And, you might argue, there are several schools of thought in D.C. Some people like Matt Pottinger and Congressman Gallagher, they actually advocated, in an article some months ago, they advocated regime change in China. And some of the more practical people in D.C. say, come on, you can't be serious, right? So there's a lot of debate in D.C. on how to deal with China, and Trump might have a very good equation with Xi Jinping, which again is actually not such a bad thing to have. It's better than going to war, right? Mm-hmm. But I don't think Trump is not the kind of guy. He believes that in a world ruled by strongmen, divided up and ruled by strongmen, but he's not going to give ground to China. He might make the odd bargain here and there, but he's not going to give ground to China. He's not the kind of guy who will ease the pressure on China.
Question.
Hi, my name is Brian Gruber. First of all, a big shout out to Dominic and the board for recognizing Steve Herman, my good friend. What he's doing is just fighting on the front lines, and terrific opening to the program tonight. So thank you for doing that. I am an American, and I noticed and loved the program tonight. I noticed the mention of Hillary Clinton once talking about the basket of deplorables, which, if memory serves me correctly, was during a private fundraising event, and it just came out. It was not really part of his speech. But if Donald Trump and his supporters can spew constant fascist, racist, misogynist language, and all this is normalized and accepted, then is there a better word, a more polite word than deplorables that Democrats can start using? Something like fascists or fascist cheerleaders? I mean, you remember the whole flyover thing from the first Trump administration. Let's find out, people in diners in Des Moines, Iowa, what they're saying about why they're voting. Maybe they're just fucking racists and fascists, and they were deplorable to begin with. So do you have a better term than deplorable?
Well, I'm going to let you take that one.
I was hoping Keith would sort of.
No, not at all. I'm gonna duck that one.
Well, one of the things that I fear about is that I saw this divide become steadily more and more toxic, and it's unimaginably toxic, which is why there's always been fear there's now growing fear. There was fear of political violence in America, and we saw that in the January 6th insurrection attempt. There has been history of political violence in America, as we know, over various things, right? Abortion clinics being bombed, assassinations and attempted assassinations of presidents and other leaders, congresspeople, whoever, So there's always this latent sort of simmering violent streak, right? And now you see Teslas being attacked, right? And so the big fear is this divide has become so stark and so deep that both sides basically loathe each other, do not want to mix with each other. If you look at the data from dating sites, internet dating sites, you find increasingly fewer and fewer people want to even meet and date with someone who has opposing political views. So this divide is just getting more acute. And while I think America is not about to sort of erupt into civil war tomorrow, and I think predictions, some people like predicting it's in terminal decline and all that. I think it would be a fatal mistake to write it off. I think the potential for more violence is becoming more and more real, more and more acute now, and that's about. Yeah,
Okay, let's take the last four people who are standing at the mic. First one.
Good evening. Thank you very much for this great talk. So my name is Remy Jarry. I'm a lecturer at Chulalongkorn University and correspondent based in Asia for the last 15 years, most of the time between China and Thailand. I wanted to ask how much we can learn from history. Following all the topic, I was thinking, for example, of the Yellow Peril, the McCarthyism, as well as also the kitchen debate between Khrushchev in the past and Nixon. And even further than that, before that, the 19th century imperialism, like few leaders sharing the world through colonies. So through these elements, I was really curious to know which one you would select and are still meaningful to understand today's world. Thank you very much.
Well, first of all, I don't think we learn much from history, unfortunately, and history just keeps repeating itself. I think McCarthyism is a good thing to keep in mind, seeing what we're seeing now. what Steve was saying. The world is, the world in their view is divided into traitors and patriots, right? Again, simplistic answers, simple one-word answers to complex questions. I could be, for example, there's no room for nuance left. I could be pro-border security. I would like to have a hard border, but I also think it's okay to have same-sex marriage. So where am I? What kind of person am I on this political spectrum? I don't fix. There's no space left in America for these kind of nuances. These complex issues are oversimplified in the public imagination. So I think McCarthyism is definitely one, and I see a lot of comparisons now in the writing to America, of America to Germany in the 1930s, and
Really?
yeah, a lot of stuff has been written about it. And you see people like Peter Thiel, all these sort of tech millionaires who are backing people like J.D. Vance and so forth, saying that we should think out of the Overton window, which is basically think the unthinkable. We should not be afraid to think completely out of the box, right? So this means we are in a very interesting new era, and it goes back a lot. I often remember, and this is a little somewhat of a digression, I often remember a manual which the Hitler dissident, Bonhoeffer, I think his name was, who wrote a manual on stupidity when he was in jail. Hitler threw him in jail. I think he was executed later, and he wrote this. And he said, never underestimate human stupidity. Again, we don't learn from history. We don't learn, because you can only identify with something you have seen and experienced. Many Americans alive today do not know what it is to live under dictatorship. They do not know what a fascist regime looks like. They don't really understand the difference between, say, socialism and communism. These nuances are lost. Everything is stark black and white, and you find, right-wing paramilitary groups walking around with, of course, they're tiny minorities still, thankfully, but walking around with swastika flags and all that as if they're in some kind of movie, You'll never find this in countries which have actually experienced that kind of regime and wars like that, But America, because it's such a vast continent, it's been a hyperpower for several decades, unrivaled hyperpower in a unipolar world for several decades. It's just not used to this sort of stuff happening at home, so they don't get it.
Okay, last three questions. 3, 2, 1.
Yes. You mentioned the United States.
Can you identify yourself?
Matthew Lafat, London Art Agency.
Yeah.
You mentioned the United States. You mentioned that the United States whipsaws back and forth. You mentioned the 1960s, but you never mentioned the Catholic Church. What's happening at USAID is similar to what Joseph McCarthy did with the State Department. He was a Catholic. He removed everyone that wasn't a Catholic, presumably because they would be anti-Catholic or pro-communist from the State Department. Same thing happening today. In the Vietnam War, that was an attempt by the Catholic Church to split the country into two, a Buddhist North and a Catholic South. There's a famous photo everyone knows about a Buddhist priest self-immolating. That's because the United States installed the brother of an archbishop in the South, who promptly turned around and began trying to expel Buddhists. Ukraine, most people don't realize, is another attempt by the Catholic Church to create a Catholic Poland as an anti-communist barrier against more Russian influence. So we've got this thing going back and forth. People mentioned the Supreme Court. So the Supreme Court has been majority Catholic for quite some time. The last president, Biden, was Catholic. Speaker of the House, Pelosi, Catholic. The vice president is also Catholic. Somehow, the Catholic Church doesn't get a mention in what's happened in the United States and this repeat. Now, in the past, what happened was that the outsiders, despite whether they're Catholic or not Catholic, would band together and essentially create a system where they would create better quality content, and that essentially allowed them to create a group of people that were worthy of being listened to. So we had a Muhammad Ali, we had a Malcolm X, we had a Martin Luther King, we had a John Lewis, right? We don't have any of those people anymore.
Can you get to the question? Because we got two people waiting.
The question is, why is that similar sort of antithesis to what's happening now? Why is it not happening today? Why do we not have a successor to a Malcolm X, to a Martin Luther King, or anybody in the United States, or quite frankly, in Europe?
Thanks.
What do you think of it? I'm going to bounce that one to you.
Are there great people, these great figures that we had, Malcolm X, et cetera, in the 1960s, Bobby Kennedy, et cetera? Why do we have these great figures?
I think they were people of their time, right? I mean, of a particular juncture in history, I would say. I mean, I'm not an expert. Otherwise, I would be still writing this book, and it would be like several thousand pages long. So I'm not an expert on the Catholic Church and all the church politics in America. But I mean, your question about the Martin Luther King Jr., Malcolm X, and so forth was a good one. And I think they were basically emerged as people. They are products of the struggles of their time.
Sure.
And they come at the right time in history.
Yeah, I would argue too that maybe America and all countries have become a lot more cynical now. So it's a lot harder for one person to emerge who everyone kind of respects in that same way that a Martin Luther King was. Next question.
Good evening. My name is John Gowdy. I'm an expat from Canada of 33 years, having lived in
51st
Finland.
state?
51st state, yes, supposedly. Having lived in Finland, Belgium, the Netherlands, the Czech Republic, Japan, China, and now Thailand for 15 years. I'm a chemical engineer, chemist, and international school teacher. I want to first thank you for writing your book and for having this gathering open forum tonight, as I believe we are presently facing a pivotal moment for democracy. My question is, based on your research and understanding of Donald Trump and his orbit, what do you feel is the ultimate goal of his tariff game and the whole flip-flop psychological application of tariffs, and how far do you think this tariff game will play out, i.e. to how many countries is it eventually going to be expanded to? What is the underlying goal, in your opinion?
Thank you. Tariffs.
Yeah, so I think the underlying premise, shall we say, is that America has been had by a lot of countries around the world for too long. It's been taken advantage of. It's a politics of grievance again, and it appeals to the base. The base also feels aggrieved. And you come along to the base. It's like in India. The Hindu right wing comes along and says, "You for years you've been invaded and this and that, and now is your time finally to stand up." So it's quite similar to what's happening in other parts of the world. So I think Trump is the kind of guy. He prides himself on the art of the deal, famously. I think he takes it absolutely to the edge of the envelope to see how much he can get away with and how much he can extract. And he's a very good guy. Sometimes he comes close to gambling the whole house, but he does extract concessions. There have been concessions by some countries. India, for example, is one I can think of, where they have lowered tariffs on some goods. Some countries will hit back, but then they reach a compromise. So the goal is basically to get better trade terms for America and encourage companies who offshore their manufacturing to do it in America. That is the strategic goal. In terms of overall political goals, I think, again, I have to go back to the idea of Western civilization as they see it, right? And a lot of people are talking about, the Western civilization must prevail. Elon Musk has been talking about it a lot. What is Western civilization, right? You tell me. So, yeah.
Last question. I know it's going to be a good one because you've been waiting.
Good evening, gentlemen. My name is Alex Price. I am an ex-Marine stationed from Okinawa, Japan. I'm currently studying economics. Now, if you were able to predict the 2016 and 2024 Trump's victory, what do you foresee in 2028? Do you potentially see MAGA splitting off to a different party, similar to the Bull Moose Party, which Theodore Roosevelt, who you could say similar attributes to Trump? Or do you see J.D. Vance transitioning power as he is a small-town hillbilly, as referenced in his book?
Yeah, that's a very good question. Excellent question to end on, actually. Because I think it's very important because Trump, of course, as we know, is 79 now, and most probably a one-time president, the one term for this term. And what happens when a movement built around a single charismatic personality, what happens to that movement when the personality suddenly disappears for one reason or the other, right? At the recent CPAC conference, the Conservative Party Action Committee, right?
Yeah.
CPAC conference. There was a straw poll in which the majority said J.D. Vance. They'd like to see J.D. Vance as the nominee in 2028. And number 2, guess who it was Steve Bannon.
Oh.
Yeah.
Not
so
Donald Trump Jr.
Yeah. So does a new leader come up? Does a new leader emerge? What direction? A splintered movement? Will the movement splinter? Will it become more extreme? Will the opposition to that become more extreme? Will the left become more extreme? These are questions which will have to be answered. And there's a lot of uncertainty again because the MAGA movement is built around this one person. Now, J.D. Vance is the heir apparent, obviously. Much more than Kamala Harris was the heir apparent. J.D. Vance is the heir apparent. But there are a lot of people, America's a big place with a lot of heavyweights who will want to, try for this power. So, it's impossible to predict.
Well, thank you, Nirmal. I'm going to take the moderator's prerogative sitting next to you to ask you to sign my book. If you've got the book, I think he might be up here to sign more, right?
Yeah,
the book's available. Yeah. He'll do this for you while Dominic closes it off. But I want to say thank you, and I'm going to turn it back over to Dominic.
Thank you very much, Keith. Good
So
to
the
be
books
back.
are available, 650 baht a snip. I'd like to thank Nirmal for writing it and carrying off the evening with a characteristic modesty. But well done, and Keith, many thanks for that. The AGM is Friday week, so please turn up if you want to have your say in the club. If you're not a member, please join. Thank you.
Thanks, Dominic. And please join. Thank you. Thanks, Keith.